Hi, Steve. I
Hi.
can't hear you. Oh, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Excellent.
Let me make sure all my notifications are off. Yep. Yep. Phone is off. Okay.
So, thank you for coming on today. I really appreciate that. You, at least in my perspective, from what I try to do on this podcast generally, are very complementary, this subject matter, your entire area of expertise. Um, I just wanted to basically share a couple things that happened to me a few months back. Basically,
Sure.
um, so I wanted to, when I started the podcast, emphasize cults, mind control, scams, things like that. And I started talking about these things with more people. And somebody, for the first time, a couple months back, I had heard the of the group, the Moonies, and that's the group that you were part of, correct?
Yep.
So, um,
Mass wedding, Washington Times newspaper, just to
well,
name a couple.
actually, where I heard of this, yeah. So, I was actually
No,
talking.
no, the Moonies own the Washington Times
Oh,
newspaper.
I know. It's that was something that I learned through you. That really caught
Hmm.
me by surprise. This group that I had never heard of before 6 months ago, they own a major publication. So my mom had brought up
And
how her
UPI and a whole bunch of other things. But anyway,
what
go on.
else? What
Sorry
else
to
was it?
interrupt you, Patrick.
The UPI.
Uh-oh, you just froze. Uh-oh.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, but I hope we won't have a problem with freezing with Zoom. That'll
Yeah.
be a drag.
If it gets too bad, we can switch over to phone conversation. But what else did you say that the Moonies owned?
UPI, United Press International, they bought. They had a whole broadcast facility that all the major networks used in DC for many, many years. I don't know if they are doing that anymore, but they used to control the media out of DC.
Wow. So, I mean, where has this been covered in other media aside from what you have done to expose it?
Depends on what you mean by covered by other media.
I guess media that would be considered mainstream.
Not really. There are researchers who've written articles about it. Robert Parry comes to mind. Frederick Clarkson comes to mind, but not in mainstream, not the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, or anything
Sure.
like that.
Um, well, it's pretty incredible that you have been able to sort of, at least it seems for a couple so what has it been, 4 decades now, effectively, since you left the moon?
Yeah, my family rescued me in 1976, so it's 44 years ago.
And you've really, it seemed like for the first part of it, aside from the family rescue, at the beginning, you were just a one-man operation, right? There was nothing really quite like what you were trying to do. Is that
Yeah,
true?
we're having a problem with Zoom with you because you're freezing and
Oh,
your audio's getting blurry.
let me try another connection. 1 second.
And FiOS 150 MPS. So I know it's pretty strong on this end.
How is this? Can you hear me?
So far, keep
Okay, we'll
talking.
we'll see. This is I just switched on to a secondary network, so we'll see how
Okay.
this works. But the question I was asking was, you were really at the beginning a one-man operation when it came to trying to expose cults and mind control, correct?
There were a group of other ex-members. There were some mental health professionals who were speaking out, some parents whose kids have gotten into cults. I can't say I was the lone person at all. In fact, there's a couple in New Jersey, Bill and Lorna Goldberg, and Lorna's brother had been in the Moonies. And when I was deprogrammed, Lorna and Bill helped me talk, to get my head together from the Moonies, and they continue to do therapy groups for ex-cult members. So they predate me, but they don't get people out of cults, and they're basically therapists who help people.
I thought it was pretty fascinating how you brought up and I should mention that I first heard of you through, let me rewind a little bit. So I've heard about a couple people in my own family and immediate relations who have actually been involved in cults and scams. And that really caught me off guard because I said, if this many people out of a small sampling size have direct involvement, then this must be a massive issue. So my mom said that one of her friends when she was younger um, was a part of the Moonies. I was overhearing somebody when I was doing some work for somebody as they were moving into an apartment mentioning a cult that they were involved in. I inquired about it. They said the Moonies. They're still operational around Boston, they were saying. My roommate right now is actually a former Jehovah's Witness. I found that out about 6 months into living with him, and
Yep.
he's completely isolated from his family. And by the way, I just talked with him the other day. He thanks you tremendously for your work.
Yeah,
Um,
thanks. Well,
and
he's isolated from his family because the group probably disfellowshipped him, which means his family would be kicked out if they talked to him, would
yeah,
be my guess.
exactly. I had a pretty interesting conversation with him. It was fascinating because I knew nothing about the Jehovah's Witnesses. And you go into it in your book. So the books that I've read of yours so far are, and you have 4 altogether from what I gather, but
Yep.
Combating Mind Control, which was the first one,
Combating
extremely
cult mind
comprehensive,
control. Yep.
and The Cult of Trump, which I also found phenomenal.
Hmm.
Um, does it frustrate you that people very loosely use the word cult? Do you know what I mean?
No, that's my frustration, is that it is such an epidemic
Mhm.
around the world, and that cult groups and lawyers that are hired by cult groups and PR firms that are hired by cult groups and search engine optimization companies that are hired by cult groups, uh, and Wikipedia is being, used to keep people confused about the difference between a destructive mind control authoritarian group and a fringe but free, benign cult group. So for me, the word cult in and of itself is not automatically pejorative.
Sure,
Um, and as you probably know, I have an influence continuum that talks about ethical influence to unethical
sure.
influence, that legitimate groups tell you upfront who they are, what they believe, and what will happen to you. And destructive cults will lie to you, will withhold vital information, or distort it. So for me, the whole notion of religion and spirituality should be based on freedom of mind and informed consent, that, hey, I'm going to join a group. And by the way, if I get in an accident, I will not be allowed to get a blood transfusion. Or,
Mhm.
if my family member or friend celebrates a birthday, I won't be able to talk with them ever again, or any number of other things that I think should be disclosed. One of the biggest ones with the Jehovah's Witnesses is they go door to door saying, we want to study the Bible with you, but they use their own translation called
Mhm.
the New World Translation, which is not recognized by any Christian or Jewish theologian as being an accurate translation. But people don't know that unless they've done their homework.
Mhm.
They think they're studying the Bible, but they're getting recruited into a mind control cult.
And
And
today people say, well, where, if they want to do their homework, they say, where do I do my homework? Because there is so much information today. It's like trying to, I like the analogy, like trying to drink from a fire hose or a fire hydrant.
yeah, so
It,
it is, there was a period when the internet started that it was a great plus for ex-members and people who were critics of authoritarian groups, because it was a way of sharing information instantly worldwide. But over the decades, and again with the wealthy cults, they can manipulate information, they can put up phony websites, they can hack into critics' stuff, computers, and do malware, and delete forums and archives. And so how do people find out? I think they need to use critical thinking, be a good consumer, do what's called Boolean searches, or complex searches on Google and Bing and other search engines, where they put terms in quotation marks with pluses and minuses, and then not accept just the first page of results, but dig deeper. And know that if a group is legitimate, it will stand up to scrutiny. And if a group is legitimate and you ask them direct questions, they'll give you direct answers that are factual or trustworthy. And if a group isn't legitimate, if it is a mind control cult, they're going to make you feel bad for being suspicious, or they'll try to change the subject and deflect you, or attack your race, or attack your class, or attack something to put you on the defensive. Whereas again, if a group is legitimate, it will stand up to scrutiny, will welcome questions. Like anyone that's involved with any person or group that won't allow questions and independent research, run. Just immediately, there's no point of discussing it. Just get the heck away. And avoid anybody who's into black and white, all or nothing, good versus evil extremes of don't trust the media. You know, if they say anything negative, huh? That's what authoritarian dictators say. That's what mind control cults say. No, like, you're an intelligent person, you're an adult, think and analyze the facts. And like I said, ask questions and ask both sides questions. And the other thing is, there are people like myself who have a long track record. You know, I've told my story umpteen times and been on TV shows, etc. And my reputation is important to me. That's not to say that there aren't people who try to lie about me and try to do black PR on me. I think still on the first 10 hits of Google, if you do my name, there's a front group of Scientology that has a page up on me that I beat and torture and kidnap people because I'm a religious bigot. So, I mean, if you look it up, you go, oh, who is Stans? Oh, it's Scientology. Is this a credible source for information about Steve? Hey, Steve, they say you're a kidnapper. You know, what's the truth? Well, actually, when I was deprogrammed in 1976, I was involved with deprogramming for 1 year with people in the Moonies. I never kidnapped people, but I was involved with some involuntary cases. I've sworn those off in 1977, you know, and these stories that are made up are BS, you know, because if they weren't, they would go to, you know, they would make a lawsuit against me. I would be, you know, held accountable in a court of law, etc. And there's just these affidavits supposedly with initials from 35, 40 years ago. So it's like, okay, what's that about?
I've seen the Scientology documentaries like Going Clear, and I actually, when I went on a road trip 4 or 5 years back with some friends, I stopped. They thought I was crazy, but I stopped at the Scientology church right on the Hollywood, right across from the Chinese movie theater, and on the strip there, and just kind of asked them, okay, show me your promotional video or whatever. And they sat me down, they gave me a copy of Dianetics and or Personal Efficiency, in a DVD. But I've seen what they do, where they have targeted harassment and intimidation campaigns.
Oh,
And,
they do. It's called, it's fair game. I have a lot of friends who are former officials in Scientology who have had the courage to stand up and speak the truth about what goes on inside. Leah Remini, who was in
oh,
35 years,
fan
and
of
Mike
hers.
Rinder, who was in 46 years,
Mhm.
won Emmys for 3 years with their show outing Scientology. I appeared at the end of season 1 in a segment with Lawrence Wright, who did the Going Clear documentary and book, and an attorney, Ray Jeffries, I think is his name. But the thing that frustrates me the most is that we have a president who is displaying all the stereotypical profile, features of a cult leader: the malignant narcissism, the lack of empathy, the need for attention and grandiosity, the pathological lying, the believing he's above the law, the attacking the critics and putting them down. I have a whole list in my, I think it's chapter 3 of The Cult of Trump.
You painted that
Um,
picture extremely well, bringing those components together.
yeah, so I feel like it stood the test of time. The book came out in October, but a lot of Trump supporters immediately attacked me and say I'm in the cult of Soros or I'm in the cult of the Democrats. And my book really is not political, even though it's called The Cult of Trump. It's really about anti-authoritarianism and anti-mind control,
I think that's fair.
for rule of law, and for the separation of church and state. So people have the freedom to decide if they want to believe or not, and not have it imposed on them. I believe in women's rights to control their own bodies. I believe in gay rights.
Mhm.
But a lot of the cults that are in the cult of Trump that form his base are thinking they're getting direct revelations from God, and they have to cast out Satan out of
Yeah.
people, and they're doing the control of behavior, information, thoughts, and emotions to make people dependent and obedient.
Well, you make such a convincing case in the book, and you lay it out bit by bit, and that's unfortunately what I really think has been lacking in the media over the last 3 years. It's really been, I mean, first of all, media tends to give people, and I'm sure you've, through the content that you've read, what you've talked about, I think you know what media tends to do. And you actually recommended that documentary, The Century of Self, which is,
Uh-huh.
it talks about, and let's see, what is the book? Manufacturing Consent. I'm sure you've read or
Noam
heard of Noam
Chomsky
Chomsky book.
and Adam Curtis. So what everyone needs to understand is that psychology has undergone a huge revolution or evolution over the last century in particular, and that marketers are experts at knowing how to implant needs and wishes and ideas that people never had before, but to make them feel like they need a certain toothpaste to be happy,
Mhm.
or a certain car, or a certain, their house has smells, so they need a certain, chemical spray to get rid of the bad smell.
Mhm.
And this kind of push towards consumerism over values and over human rights.
Mhm.
And the knowledge has gone on digital to the point now where there are AI programs that can track memes, and can artificially create powerful memes that get a big audience, or undercut memes that should get a lot of attention by creating a false news story that diverts everybody's attention.
Man, and when you're always appealing to advertisers and trying to effectively give people what gives them a dopamine rush,
Mm.
then the analysis remains very surface level. And I think that that is what has driven my frustration and a lot of people's frustrations and caused them to tune out of the whole Trump phenomenon over the last 3 years, which is a bad thing. And
Yeah.
that's why it was so refreshing to see how you just brought everything together. And I know I keep saying that, but for example, a couple months back, I saw the documentary "The Family" on Netflix. You talk about that. You talk about uh, this is something that I didn't really know much about until recently, but there's an author, maybe you've heard of him. His name is John Ronson. He actually does some similar stuff to what you do.
Haven't
Um,
heard of him yet, but now
okay.
that I have.
He's got a book about public shaming, and he stayed with fringe groups before. But John Ronson, he talks about uh, basically. What was I going to say? Um, he talks about the different cult groups and effectively. Oh, I'm sorry. He has a book called The Psychopath Test. That's the connection to John Ronson.
Oh,
And in the first time I had read that book, it talks about how people in positions of power are disproportionately likely to have psychopathic, sociopathic, and narcissistic tendencies. And that really started to get me to think, and I learned a lot about narcissistic personality disorder. And then when you brought it up in the book in that way, related to Donald Trump, it really drove the point home. I thought you did a great job with that.
yeah, thanks. Um, yeah, so all I can do is say yes. We know a lot about healthy human psychological development, and we know a lot now about unhealthy psychological human development. And Bandy Lee, who's a forensic
Mhm.
psychiatrist who teaches at Yale Law School, edited a book called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, and had 27 in the first edition and then 37 in the second edition of the book, laying out the case that he's unfit for power and to lead a country. And she's been largely suppressed by the media. She has not gotten the ability to speak to the general public the way I believe she should be. And they cite the Goldwater rule, but her position is she's not diagnosing him in a clinical sense. She says, my expertise is evaluating dangerousness. And
Mhm.
she said, when somebody says I could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and my followers will still believe me, this is not the statement of a healthy person,
Yeah.
right? And there are endless examples of his psychopathology that shows his lack of fitness to be president, and yet there's like no interest. And there is I think it's the 25th Amendment allows for people in government to say the president is not fit for duty,
Mhm.
but Trump's got such control over everyone. Everyone's cowering in fear that it's not even brought up as a possibility, even though it's so clear that he's not fit for leadership.
It fascinates me how mundane the reasons are. How people go along with things that are immoral or amoral. It's not like people look back at, and I know people always make comparisons to Nazi Germany and Hitler, and it's cheap, and I know that, and
I
it's
don't think it's cheap.
well, a lot of the time it is. It's like people. This is. It's kind of like what I was talking about at the beginning. How people use the term cult so much that, in a sense, they devalue it, and it becomes almost like a cry wolf when people misuse it frequently. People do that with like I think that Nazi and Hitler have become political smears, like communist was in a way. But in this sense. So there was a book you probably seen it at one point, called Ordinary Men by Richard Browning. And it's about how um, different men in Germany were basically recruited to the Nazi cause as part of the SS. And they did so for reasons like career climbing, you know, status, or not looking weak in front of their peers. It wasn't like they had ideological allegiance to Hitler. They hadn't read
Sure,
Mein Kampf. They hadn't done anything like that. So
sure.
it's the same thing with Trump. It's like people that cluster themselves in that inner circle around Trump, they might just be trying to advance their own careers.
Oh, 100%. So, I mean, I write in my book about the Kochs, for example, the Mercers. I talk about, you know, the libertarian extremists that want to shrink government.
Mm-hmm.
I talk about the New Apostolic Reformation, which is the religious, they're referred to in the media as evangelicals, but my evangelical friends are like, oh my God, these are not people who love Jesus or
Yeah.
want to follow the Bible. They're preaching a prosperity gospel. They're, you know, give us all your money and God will bless you. And you're putting money on your credit card because you have no money, and they've got hundreds of millions of dollars. It goes on, but the thing that, so there is absolutely many different factions that are each authoritarian from my perspective, that have a vested interest in the Trump administration, and in many cases are influencing Trump to do policies that benefit their industries, fossil fuel, for example, Putin and the Koch brothers, or Koch, because one of them passed away. But the bottom line is, if we want democracy to work, we need to have a system of checks and balances, and we need to have a framework of the law
Yeah.
and justice that works. And that doesn't mean putting hundreds of unqualified people on the federal bench because they're right wing and they're going to do you favors,
Mm-hmm.
which is what Trump has been doing and Mitch McConnell has been doing, etc. We really need, Patrick, to have an educated citizenry, and we need to convey to everyone that it matters. Their vote matters, where they spend their time, if they're on websites,
Mm-hmm.
what they're watching, what they're consuming, and they need to be thinking about survival, you know, and survival of the planet.
Yes.
Because with a global pandemic, there is no solution without everyone in the world cooperating
Yeah.
and sharing knowledge about the virus and how to help people who've been affected, or how to develop a vaccination. And then the other big thing is global climate crisis, which is documented on the nasa.gov website. It's real. It's not a hoax. And anyone who says it's a hoax, you have to look at who's paying them and what's their agenda, because it's clear that there's catastrophic changes that are happening to our planet. And, you know, I want to live. I want my kid to live. I want grandkids to live. I want generations to have a habitat that's livable.
Yeah.
And this kind of, you know, one belief system that is really upsetting to me, but it's believed by millions of people, and I would say Christians, Muslims, Jews even, this notion that Armageddon is going to happen, the last days are going to happen, and God's going to do a miracle and wash everything away, and people will go to heaven and the earth will be reborn. That's magical thinking.
Yeah.
And that's not my understanding of Jesus, of Judaism, of our relationship that we were instructed biblically to be stewards of. That whole notion of it doesn't matter what we do to the oceans now because God's going to make it all better.
Yeah. Let
No,
everything fall into disrepair.
no. My notion is God works through human beings, and we each have a responsibility. When we look in the mirror, we need to hold ourselves accountable for our choices and our behaviors. So, I want to take this opportunity to just say one of the biggest frustrations I've had with getting my message out about the cult of Trump is that, I'm not saying people who believe in Trump are stupid or crazy or just brainwashed fools. I do think they've been unduly influenced. But that's an opinion. It's not based on each individual person. But I'm encouraging people who have family and friends who are in the Trump camp to have relations with them, to have conversations with them, respectful ones where you find common ground, instead of calling each other stupid or crazy or bad or like I'm in the cult of Soros. Let's talk about what a cult is. Let's talk about the bite model. Let's talk about the influence continuum.
Well,
You want me to hear a critical thing? Give it to me. Let me listen. Let's discuss it. Because if it's real, it'll stand up to scrutiny.
what you've done is the basis for those conversations to begin, in that I've realized that one of the things that must occur at the very beginning is a conversation about defining the terms. And if you don't agree on what the terms mean at the very beginning, you're never going to agree as you move further into the discussion and it gets more complex. And when you just define the cult right up, what a cult is right up front like that, it wipes away the sort of generic, everyday, different definitions that people use for cult. You say undue influence and mind control; those define a cult. And you have the bite model, and it's clear, and you compile the resources in one accessible place. So that's useful. I think that that education needs to be reformed largely to emphasize the faculty of critical thought rather than uh, teaching to the test. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. Critical thought is one part of it, but also realizing we're very emotional
Yeah.
beings, and our emotions are easy to tap,
Mm-hmm.
and especially fear.
Totally.
It's very easy to activate our amygdala to make us go, warning, warning. But then you need to have that critical faculty to go, is there real danger, or is this an irrational fear
Yeah.
that somebody's deliberately trying to stoke in order to get me to distrust somebody or to distrust some source of information and such. And it's always easier to see a mind control cult over there or over there.
Yep.
When I was in the Moonies, it was obvious the Scientologists were a cult, the Hare Krishnas were a cult, the Children of God were a cult. But when people attacked me or said Moon was a con artist and he wasn't the Messiah, I was programmed to believe that's Satan trying to attack me, trying to trip me up. I was trained to do thought stopping, to chant in my own head, to get rid of these doubts and these negative energy that was coming at me. But again, having had that experience, having had the opportunity to be deprogrammed and research the whole political evolution of the term brainwashing in a political context, and then see how it was done in so many other destructive cults. There are patterns that become really, really obvious. And so, for example, I believe that each person is unique, right? But mind control cults, they want to make people over in the image of the leader.
Yeah.
And they want everyone to think the right way, feel the right way, act the right way. And if they don't, they get punished or they get threatened to be kicked out or something. That's not encouraging individuality and conscience and creativity and reality testing.
And by the way, I should mention what you talk about in the book, which is that cults come in a variety of forms. So it's not just the typical religious or political cult that we think of. You talk
Right.
about economic cults and different scams.
Like traffickers, labor and sex
Yes,
traffickers or
exactly.
pimps
Yep.
are cult leaders, in my opinion, or therapists who are unethical, who make their clients dependent on them rather than helping them get functional and moving them out of the office and go live a life.
Sure.
There are large group awareness trainings that are doing mind control that I don't think is ethical.
Is that like
There are
transcendental
multi-level
medication?
marketing groups,
Who's
so-called network marketing
the
groups, where
one that
they
you talked
promise
about before?
they'll make $1 million in part-time, and it's a lot of hypnosis and mind control stuff.
Was the category that you mentioned there in the middle? I think it was an awareness cult or something.
Large group awareness trainings,
Is that
yeah.
like transcendental meditation? Is that one of the?
I think of TM more as a religious cult,
Okay.
the Hindu sort, even though they say that it's not religious, it really is, and they're being taught a Hindu methodology that even the gurus that supposedly initiated Maharishi, but they said that they never did. They said that you can't sell a spiritual practice, but TM sells you the mantra
Yeah.
and to teach you properly how to meditate. I'm very critical of transcendental meditation, by the way, as a cult group, and I wrote about them in my book.
That is something that I want to learn more about, but I did watch a video about it the other day because that was the first time I had heard about it in your book. And I did see that actually. Is there an informal, like lowercase TM versus a capital one? Because there was a bunch of celebrities in Hollywood, like Jerry Seinfeld and George Stephanopoulos, who are talking about how they are involved in TM. And I was thinking, are they involved in
Yeah, that's the bad one. The only other TM is trademark.
Yeah, well, no, they were talking about transcendental
Yeah,
meditation.
no, there's only one cult group. Maharishi died. This is the group that the Beatles, went to India, and I think it was John Lennon wrote "Sexy Sadie" about Maharishi because he was womanizing, even though he was portrayed as a celibate guru. But unfortunately, I've seen more recently Ringo and Paul doing some type of benefit or something pro TM, which appalled me,
Hmm. They
and
let
appalls
people
all
lend
of.
their name and credibility, right?
Yeah, I mean, celebrities are influential, and they can lead people in good directions or bad directions. And if they didn't do their due diligence homework, they can often get into bad groups themselves.
Sure.
I should say there's a new book out by an ex-TM teacher, and his name is Aryeh Siegel. I wrote a blog on my Freedom of Mind site about his book. I want to say it's Transcendental Deception,
Hmm.
and if it's important, I can go to my bookcase and grab the title. But anyone can do transcendental meditation plus cult plus brainwashing plus mind control plus ex-member, and just start reading, because there's a lot of people who've been writing about it.
Man, so would I have been meaning to ask you about this? Would you consider Tony Robbins to be in the cult sphere or a borderline case or outside of it? Because I don't know much about, but I've seen.
I'm not a fan of Tony Robbins at all. I first heard of Tony Robbins when he was doing firewalking,
Mhm.
which is a scam unto itself, because anyone can walk on wooden coals
Yeah,
if they're properly prepared, and their feet are wet beforehand and they're just walking quickly. But he apparently studied neurolinguistic programming,
yeah.
or NLP, It's something that I studied in 1980 and 81 in great depth. But he studied it, and he basically created a franchise teaching NLP without calling it NLP. He did a buy-off to the founders of NLP. And there's a documentary, Tony Robbins, I Am Not Your Guru, on Netflix, if you want to see an example of a large group awareness training.
Is this this sounds like it would be more critical of Tony Robbins, correct?
No, it was an authorized documentary. He thinks it's a great promotion for people to buy his tapes and books and everything. But if you know anything about mind control groups, or if you know anything about therapy and actual psychological counseling, it's not a. It shows it as not a good thing, in my
This
opinion.
this is where the plot thickens. Is first of all, you have people effectively marketing these dark psychological practices in group psychology and individual psychology and selling them to a wide audience, and that is really dangerous if the average person uses it without any ethical boundaries. And I definitely see the rise of certain cultures online and in the real world. Like, I'm not sure if you're familiar with pickup artist culture.
Oh, absolutely. That's out of the NLP school of covert hypnosis. I want to say that I was out of the Moonies for 4 years. I had read endless books and journal articles about persuasion, brainwashing, mind control, attitude change, etc. And there was still a missing element that I couldn't identify until a friend of mine invited me to a workshop with Richard Bandler, who was one of the founders of NLP. And I went to this workshop. It was the first workshop that I went to after the Moonies, other than being in college.
Hmm.
It was the first workshop, and I was like piecing in the back of the room, and I was watching him manipulate people. And I was like, this is a psychopath, but what he's doing and how he's talking, what reminds me of the Moonies,
Mhm.
and the kind of way I used to talk in the Moonies, Patrick,
Wow.
was a very special kind of way.
Are there videos of that anywhere?
Huh?
Are there videos of that anywhere? Or could I see a video of Moon talking and sort of assume that that's what
No,
he's.
Moon was mostly talking in Korean and had
Oh.
a, it was, in any case, what I want to just get to the point I'm trying to get to, which is when I saw it, I was like, holy mackerel, I want to know this stuff. And so I started getting training. I paid my money. I was a practitioner, a master practitioner. And I was even invited to be an apprentice to the other founder of NLP, John Grinder. I moved to Santa Cruz. And when I was out there doing all of these intensive workshops and such, it became obvious to me that this was an amoral system, and it really depended on people's ethics, their own individual ethics
Hmm.
of how they use this stuff. And I should add that Grinder and Bandler developed NLP based on Milton Erickson, who was a psychiatrist, who was committed to helping his patients get better. And he pioneered a whole nother approach to hypnosis, which was very process oriented and very naturalistic, unlike what had existed prior to Erickson, which was a very direct suggestion, use of authority approach,
Hmm.
which if people obeyed you, then they were hypnotizable, and if they didn't obey you, they weren't. But basically, Erickson said everyone goes in and out of trance all day long. Whenever our attention goes inside, whenever we imagine something, our minds are not engaged in the here and now and analytic critical thinking. So his style was to talk conversationally, to tell stories, but to watch the person's reactions and to use their own responses as a tool for directing them in a therapeutic direction. But people who studied NLP were like, how can we sell more cars? You
Yeah.
know, how can I get women, you know, to have sex with me when I'm an overweight, ugly person?
Mhm.
And they would never give me the time of day. And they started doing this dark practice, as you were saying, this unethical practice of using these techniques without ethics and for their power and their money and their sexual hunger.
It sort of seems like at times that we live in a world of Rasputins.
So, you know, it things swing, and we go through periods of darkness and then hopefully corrective measures. But this gives me another opportunity to spout out about people who say we live in a post-truth world,
Hmm.
or who put down experts or who put down science.
Or
And
people who are
that,
anti-intellectual. That's
yeah, and right. So, but we don't live in a post-truth world. You know, truth is still an important value, and the whole scientific method assumes we don't know the truth with a capital T, and it assumes that we have ideas, and then we do experiments to test those ideas, and we're prepared to abandon them when the better hypothesis comes along, or
Mhm.
we can demonstrate that the experimentation was flawed in the first place. That's how we've evolved as a species
Sure.
to be able to live to 100 years of age. People were living to 20, 30 years of age, you know, a century, 2 centuries ago. We have the capacity to stop a global pandemic,
Mhm.
you know, like 1918, which killed 50 million or more people, except we need to use our science and we need to use our technology wisely, right? But you know, another important concept that I want to mention, if I may, and I wrote about it in chapter 7, I believe, of The Cult of Trump,
Mhm.
is this notion of fourth generation warfare
Yeah.
that I learned about in researching the book. And it's essentially a psyops uh, approach that an American military strategist, William Lynn, came up with in the 80s.
Mhm.
And that, you know, our intelligence agencies did on dictatorships and other countries that we didn't like so much, even overthrowing democratically elected governments in our past.
Other, by the way,
But
other
now,
books that you mentioned,
what's that?
I was going to say other books that you mentioned in relation to that. You mentioned Tim Weiner's or Tim Weiner. I don't know his name, but I believe you mentioned his books. I thought you had mentioned either Legacy of Ashes or Enemies. Maybe
Wasn't me.
okay.
But I did write about fourth generation warfare, which
Okay.
is not psychological warfare to convert the enemy to your way of thinking. It's psychological warfare to confuse, to create numbness, overload people, to get people to distrust leaders, to get them to distrust institutions, so that they are more readily willing and able to be indoctrinated into an authoritarian worldview.
Mhm.
And that's exactly what Donald Trump's whole regime has been doing. Like, why would anyone put someone in charge of the EPA who doesn't believe in the EPA,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
It's to get people to distrust the EPA, you know, to get people to distrust the government in and of itself. Why? Because our enemies, like Putin, wants to minimize America's power and prestige and authority, wants to get rid of the Magnitsky Act so he can get billions of his dollars that was frozen because of his regime's torture of the attorney Magnitsky. Um, but people need to understand this is an intentional process from the outside of the US and from within the United States
Mhm.
to create, you know, hatred, distrust, create factions, to disrupt our feeling of, you know, we're all Americans, we believe in the Constitution, We believe, we should have fair elections. We believe we should have media that is responsible to the facts,
Mhm.
and that if it isn't, if any entity is saying mistruths, they should not be, allowed to keep broadcasting.
Yeah.
Except, as I documented in my book, laws got passed that took away that responsibility from broadcasters,
Mhm.
where they can call themselves entertainment instead of news organizations, and can literally do disinformation and propaganda things without legal recourse, without any accountability.
What concerns me, and you bring this up in the Cult of Mind Control book, and you probably bring it up on freedomofmind.com as well. I just haven't been on the website yet, but the different barriers that stand in the way of bringing this out into the open. So the first being in the media itself. So within Hollywood, as we talked about before, different actors belong to different cult groups, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, obviously Scientology, transcendental meditation. So I think there's fear of upsetting different, actors. So that's why you don't see it in like movies and TV shows as much. And then within the media itself, it's fear of lawsuits and intimidation from these extremely powerful
Yep.
organizations. And then
Yep.
you talk about how at the political level, I don't know if you mentioned this directly, but you kind of allude to it, is the government has a history of attempting this itself through MK Ultra, right? Through the CIA mind control experiments. And so,
Well, that goes back to the Cold War. Russia and China were trying to figure out better ways to predict and control human behavior.
yeah,
And Alan Dulles of the CIA was like, we need to know all this stuff. We need to be at the forefront of it. So they empowered people to do LSD experiments and hypnosis experiments, which included Milton Erickson, by the way, who I mentioned previously, and do all kinds of horrendous behavior. But the MK Ultra program never. They said they stopped it,
hmm,
but the interest of the intelligence services in understanding more how the mind works and how to manipulate the mind has never stopped.
yeah, and I
And when
think,
I was deprogrammed from the Moonies, I was approached on 3 separate occasions by the CIA, who wanted to recruit me. And they said explicitly they wanted to know more about deprogramming terrorists. That
hmm,
was in 76, 77. Lewis, Jolly, and West, who had been part of MK Ultra, according to my sources, directly tried to recruit me as his student. He wrote a very nice review of Combating Cult Mind Control in the American Journal of Psychiatry. But I said, I want to do a book on mind control. He said, outline it. And then I went into MK Ultra and everything else, and that was done. It
yeah.
was done that then. He wanted nothing more to do with me as
I I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist here, but I really do see a thread there where if the government were to dive into investigation of cults and revoking 501c3 tax exemption status from different organizations, then they might be confronted with what they did and having to admit to MK Ultra. So
a 100%.
there might be
But the
pressure from
Moonies
the CIA.
were I didn't know this at the time, and I was an expert witness for a House congressional investigation when I first exited the Moonies, and I gave over copies of all my internal documents of Moon wanting to take over the government and get rid of democracy, which was satanic. But once Jonestown happened, I read through the entire transcripts. It was about 11 volumes, and they actually had interviewed the founder of the Korean CIA, who said he organized and utilized the Unification Church for use as a political tool, which was the cult I was in. And it was being used to counter North Korean brainwashing, to have a place to send dissidents in South Korea so they would think the right way.
Yeah.
and support the regime. And it was only after America left Vietnam theater that the Moonies were imported to the United States to stop the commies on campuses.
Hmm.
And that was the context where I was recruited. So I said this in Combating Cult Mind Control, I think it was chapter 2, that I was an experiment, if you will, a field experiment for intelligence services to advance, a right-wing agenda that was very much doing things that would violate American law.
Wow, that is quite a realization to have.
Yeah, so the Washington Times, UPI, Iran-Contra, that was the Washington Times was the front for channeling money to North
Hmm.
and all of that. So so how Moon went to jail as a felon for a felony conviction. It was on evading income taxes. But how could a felon from another country own a newspaper in their nation's capital, a newspaper that never made money for the first 25 years? Like, where's $2 billion coming from? And why would a foreign, an entity with ties to a foreign government, how could they own an information source in our nation's capital?
I'm with you. A little bit fishy.
Yeah, George Bush Sr. was head of the CIA, by the way, during that congressional investigation. And the staff director of it said he did everything in his power to block the investigation from finding out stuff.
Man, and you said that you said the Washington Times was
Times.
Reagan's favorite newspaper, or at least he said that it was.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
so many presidents, conservative presidents, have endorsed the Washington Times.
Oh boy. Um,
It doesn't mean that everyone who writes for the Washington Times is a Mooney.
yeah,
They hire lots of people who are not believers in
but
order to create the idea that it's a legitimate newspaper.
yeah. Um, so two final topics, and we'll get to them in quick succession. But one of them is how you mentioned how the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychology, the sort of holy grail or the Bible of psychology, the fifth edition right now mentions a certain class of disorders at the end related to mind control. But most psychologists actually aren't trained in how to identify or treat or deal with this, correct?
Correct. So the book is by the American Psychiatric Association. It's kind of the manual that insurance companies use to give reimbursements.
Mm.
So if you want to get money for working with somebody, you need to fit them into a category that is in there as a legitimate
Mhm.
problem. And the fifth edition, the fourth edition, and I believe the third edition even had a dissociative category that mentioned brainwashing, cults, coercive persuasion. But it was kind of a catch-all
Yeah.
category, but it was significant that it was even there because cults will like to say, it's not real, it doesn't exist,
Mhm. How do you define
one
it? That kind of stuff, right?
one person's cult is another person's religion, and who are we to say? Well, as a mental health professional for over 35 years, when you have a dissociative disorder, you're split from your body. You're split in your mind of who am I? And to use myself as an example, there was the Steve Hassan before the Moonies who wrote poetry, played basketball, and loved girlfriends.
Mhm.
And then I got into the Moonies and I was celibate. I threw out my poetry. I dropped out of college. I turned my back on my religion. I'm Jewish, and I came to believe the Holocaust was a necessary thing because the Jews didn't accept Jesus.
Whoa.
And so I had these two selves. And when I was deprogrammed, my real self kind of popped up, but I still had all this indoctrination into believing Moon and his wife were my true parents,
Mhm.
and the whole system of ideology in it. And so my therapy, going forward, needed to go back into my indoctrination, read the Divine Principle textbook, which was the Moonies Bible, read the Bible and learn about brainwashing, and just kind of sort through what's real, what isn't real, what do I believe, using who I was before the Moonies as a baseline for my value system.
That perpetual dissonance is quite a fascinating component of cult identity. So the last question that I have really is, and this could open up a lot, but um, so I don't know if you've heard of this guy before, but his name is Jordan Peterson. He had quite a following, and he's still pretty big. But he had a lot of young men that were interested in what he had to say about taking on personal responsibility and individual critical thought and things like that, which aren't lessons that you really hear about a lot in the media or in just sort of everyday conversation. So a lot of younger men gravitated towards him, and it caused people to assume he was like an alt-right figure and really question him and call him a cult, which is kind of ironic because he was talking about free thought and free expression. But he was talking about how there's so many young men, disaffected young men, and when you have that at a societal level, that leads to all kinds of problems. I think that is a high up contributing factor to the proliferation of cults and scams. But is there anything that, I don't know, is there anything that you have to say about that, or any other societal thing that you can identify right now that you think is a major contributor towards the proliferation of these cults and scams?
Well, first of all, I really have not spent time learning about Jordan Peterson. I've had many people say that they've read my stuff and they listen to him and they think
Sure.
he's a cult leader, but that doesn't mean anything substantial to me other than they said these things.
Yeah.
I certainly can cite one of my mentors, Philip Zimbardo, of the famous Zimbardo prison experiment at Stanford, who, by the way, taught a course for 15 years, The Psychology of Mind Control, and used 2 chapters of my book, Combating Cult Mind Control. But he's done a TED Talk on the demise of guys that I highly recommend people look at.
I would really like to listen to that.
There's a lot of things. Like I really think that divorce is a major issue. People moving so many times has created a lack of continuity. I read recently an article about how the nuclear family was a big error because it took people away from their extended family and their community, which would raise young people. So, I mean, there's so many factors right now that are moving us to be more isolated rather than feeling more connected. And the pandemic is not helping at all in this way. But I want to cite, and then I'm going to need to go. I have another interview. But I listened to a man named Steve Silberman who wrote a book called Neurotribes. And it was in the context of him speaking at an autism conference. And he proceeded to talk about how he thinks Silicon Valley has been dominated by people who are high functioning, like Asperger's, on the spectrum, where they're not able to read social cues off of people's faces. They're very comfortable with screens, and how they've developed this whole industry for what works for them.
Yeah.
But it's rewiring what is called neurotypicals to be more like them.
Yep.
As opposed to helping them learn how to read social cues and be more neurotypical.
That makes a lot of sense.
And so, you know, when you're in a room physically and everybody's looking at you on a laptop in front of them because they're more comfortable looking at the screen than looking at you, that's kind of weird.
Yeah, it is. I'll pretty much end it there. I just want to say that I think technological displacement is going to be an increasing factor in cults and scams. So I'm glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, and VR headsets can be an incredible plus, but I can only imagine how cult mind controllers could use it to program people and brainwash them to become terrorists, to use one example, or sex slaves.
Yeah.
It's really sad.
Well, I can only hope that people start to question their fictions a bit more. So thank you.
And my work is really one of hope. And so
It is.
I want to end on hope that ex-members who've had these experiences, people like yourself who've met people who've been in cults, amplifying that messaging that we're not stupid, where it's nothing wrong with us other than we were lied to, manipulated, and indoctrinated, and there's life after cult is ultimately the message I want to get across.
Excellent, Stephen. And so at the very end, is there anything besides freedomofmind.com in your books, like Cult of Mind Control and I'm sorry, and
Combating Cult Mind Control, Freedom of Mind,
yep.
and the Cult of Trump. And I have a lot of blogs and a big, robust YouTube channel.
Excellent.
And I'm Cult Expert on Twitter. And if you find value in this message, learn more and start educating the people you know. And then hopefully we can build more of a consumer awareness movement about the healthy psychology versus unhealthy psychology. And ultimately, you know, the anti-vax movement, I believe, is being pushed by foreign governments and people who want to see the demise of democracy. And ultimately, we're going to need to have a cure that everyone has, and not, you know, have gunfire in the streets because people say, I want my freedom and I'm not going to wear a mask, or I'm not going to, you know, vaccinate my kid. You know, if the vaccination is proven to be safe, you know, in 99.9% of every case, as a society, as a world, we need to protect everyone in public health.
Well, I will help your objectives in whatever ways that I can.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Patrick. Have a
Thank
good
you,
one.
Steve. Have a nice day.
Yeah. Bye-bye.